Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father John Lovell, and this is Hope in the Desert. Thank you for joining me again. As I mentioned in the last show, we have relaunched, and I want to thank in a special way Restoring Christian Culture podcast, as well as Sanctus Ranch, Dan Seveny and Matthias Seveny for producing this show. Today I have a very special guest, a very good friend of mine, a friend who I met after the Coalition for Canceled Priests was founded. He was a priest that came to the coalition asking for help, and when the coalition imploded, he stuck by my side and was one of my great defenders and champions. So I would like to welcome Father Vaughn Treco. Father, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you very much. You have a very interesting story. You were not a cradle Catholic. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought you to Catholicism?
Yes, I was born and raised within the Plymouth Brethren movement, and it was a devout. I had the good fortune of having devout evangelical parents, and they taught me, gave to me a great love for the Scriptures, and inculcated a great love for Jesus Christ. So my foundation was, you could say, principally biblical as I was growing up. And what led me from that to Catholicism was a continual renewing of my understanding of what the Scriptures actually said. The Plymouth Brethren took and take the Scripture seriously, and so when they come to understand something in the Scriptures to be in conflict with even something they are doing, they would often change. What happened to me was, as I was growing up and reading the Scriptures and studying them for myself, I began to notice things in the Scriptures that just were not practiced among the Plymouth Brethren. And as I read the Scriptures, the thing that began to stand out to me was that in the earliest days of the church, even within the New Testament, there's a kind of hierarchical structure to the church. And so I began to look at that particular question. And funnily enough, while I was in seminary as an evangelical, a comment by a very liberal Protestant scholar, I think is Oscar Cullmann, he was talking about St. Paul's epistles to Timothy and Titus, and he made a comment. He said that the reason we know that these cannot be authentic Pauline letters is because they are proto-Catholic. In other words, they are operating with the very structure of the Catholic Church in view, and that obviously had to have come much later. So he rejected the Pauline authorship of those three books because of their proto-Catholic assumptions about the structure of the church. That prompted me to begin more specifically to look at Christian communities that claim to have or had bishops, priests, and deacons. And having grown up in the Bahamas, the only option that I even thought of was Anglicanism. And so while I was in the seminary, I was confirmed by Bishop Montgomery of the Chicago Diocese, Episcopal Diocese of Chicago, as an Anglican. And I began my studies as what they called an unofficial ordinan for the priesthood within the Anglican tradition. That very easily led to a consideration of Anglicanism itself, because when you enter the Anglican Church, you begin to learn more and more about it. And Anglicanism at the time, this was in the mid-'80s, was in the throes of what would become the occasion for their implosion. Yeah. They had begun the ordination of women to the priesthood, and they were publicly discussing the ordination of practicing homosexuals to the clerical state. So when my seminary days were over, that moral collapse made it impossible for me to continue into Anglican orders. And so I held back from accepting the invitation for ordination in the hopes that I would find some jurisdiction with apostolic credentials that I could then seek ordination in. That came about through the Charismatic Episcopal Church a few years later. And I was ordained to the priesthood within the Anglican communion through the Charismatic Episcopal Church in 1997 as a deacon and then a priest.
For anyone that knows you, the term charismatic as we know it does not seem to come to mind with your type of personality and the way you deliver a homily, the way you deliver a sermon. You come across more high church
Yes.
than charismatic. How were you able to minister, thrive perhaps in that sort of community?
Well, what was interesting was when I applied to become an ordinan for the Charismatic Episcopal Church, I specifically said to Bishop Randolph Sly, I said, is the Charismatic Episcopal Church big enough to include a priest that does not speak in tongues? And he said, yes, we would welcome a priest who does not speak in tongues. And so that's my entree. It also happened that the province that Bishop Sly oversaw at the time was the most Catholic, or you might say the most high church, certainly the most high church province within the Charismatic Episcopal Church. So you would say our liturgies were staid, but peppered with charismata.
Okay,
Yeah,
very good.
so-
And so you were ordained for that province, for that diocese, in that group. What brought you eventually to Catholicism?
So not long after I was ordained, I was appointed to the provincial council. So I became what is called a canon theologian to my bishop, and that's his theological advisor, and he appointed me the director of the seminary. So I took over his responsibilities to form men for the priesthood, the diaconate and the priesthood. And it was during that those months of that my first year in that position that one of my students came up to me or said at the end of class one day, Friday evening, he said, "You know, Father, your answers sound awfully Catholic." And I said, "Actually, I hadn't really thought about that." And he said, he handed me a set of tapes by Scott Hahn called Answers to Common Objections. There were 6 tapes, 6 objections, I believe. And
I'm assuming these were cassette tapes.
these were cassette tapes,
Okay.
yes, indeed.
Our
Cassette-
producer has no idea what those are. So.
Exactly. So I showed the set to my bishop, and I said, is this something I should spend my time listening to? And he said, yes, I think there'll be a profit to you. So I listened to all 6 tapes that weekend, and by the time I got to the end of the 6th tape, I realized I had a problem. Scott Hahn said these are the 6 common objections that people have for not becoming Catholic. Well, I had none of them. Everything that the Catholic Church believed, I believed. So that Monday I went to my bishop and I said, if I believe all the things that a Roman Catholic Church believes, why am I not Catholic? And so I suggested I should resign. He said, very prudently, he said, I understand your dilemma. He said, but I think it would be wise for you to take a year to really consider it deliberately and carefully. And I did. And I thought that was very good counsel. So I spent the next year fulfilling my duties as a priest of the Charismatic Episcopal Church, preaching and teaching those things, administering the sacraments. And by the time we got to the close of that year, we had moved with the bishop to Virginia to establish a new pro-cathedral. And during that summer, shortly after that, I resigned. I said, I am convinced that the Catholic Church is the one true church, and so I must enter her.
Now, we're going to go into more detail in a moment over this, but you are also married and have children, and your entire family converted at the same time.
Yes.
It's one thing to be convinced of the truth and to convert. Scott Hahn did that. His wife did not immediately follow, though. A lot of people don't know this because his wife is an awesome Catholic as well. But correct me if I'm wrong, your entire family, your wife and your children, all converted with you at the same time. Is that correct?
Yeah.
How were you able to convince them of the truth of Catholicism?
That is true. I grew up when I grew up with my parents. My parents had a very, I found out later, sort of unique way to approach the dinner table. Every day we'd gather around the table. My dad would hand us a little card called the Bread of Life, little devotional. One side it had a scripture reading. The other side it had a meditation, brief meditation on it. And we would go around the table and we would say these things, read them, and it totally transformed our dinner conversations. Well, my wife and I didn't adopt the same thing in our family, but essentially we practiced open conversation about God and religion around the dinner table or any place else. And so my journey, which ended up being a journey to Catholicism, was a part of our public conversation. My children knew about the journey. They knew, I would talk candidly about why Anglicanism failed the test of authenticity, why Catholicism seems to meet the standard. I mean, it seems to be the only religion that actually teaches what the scriptures teach and seeks to practice it. So our conversation was public. When I came to the place where I knew I had to resign, I wrote my resignation letter, came downstairs, and I gave it to my wife for her to read. Because even though our journey we were walking this journey together, and we walked all of our transitions together. We were never out of sync. I gave her my letter, and then I said, this is going to put you in a situation where you have to decide what you want to do. Well, she said, just wait here. So she went upstairs into our office, and she came down later with her letter of resignation. And what was intriguing to me was I got to Catholicism thinking my way through it. Mm-hmm. But what my wife's letter revealed was she got to Catholicism intuiting her way there. Mm. The language I think is a good way to put it is how when the church promulgated the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, it used a language of fittingness. It was fitting, like that, and that I think that really characterizes how Norma's journey from evangelicalism to Anglicanism to Catholicism went. It just seemed to fit.
Yeah, but you also had children.
That
Also at the same time, because it's interesting, because I do want you to speak about this a little bit of when you converted and where were all of you when this happened. You were talking about Virginia, so please fill us in on that as well.
Yeah, so by the time I was ready to convert and my wife was ready to convert, we had moved to Northern Virginia. We were living in Sterling, Virginia, and we assisted at Mass at St. Catherine of Siena in Great Falls. Now, we had to pass another Catholic church in order to get there, but let's put it like this. That particular parish was not wholesome for authentic Catholicism.
I think I know the parish that you're referring to, so
yes.
Go ahead.
But my children were still young. Michael, this is the year 2000, Michael was 10, going to become 11, right? That would make Jackie 7, and Catherine 4. So in a sense, you would say Michael converted with his mind, but me and Michael had talked all through this. I mean, he would have conversation with my parents, and my parents were good defenders of evangelicalism, so he heard the arguments for and against from both sides, and he entered the church with his mind alert to it. In fact, when we started visiting St. Catherine, before we had actually joined RCIA, Michael, after Mass, took me by the hand, took me up to the Knights of Columbus table, and he said, "You have to join this. And we were not even Catholic. So he asked, I believe he went on to ask the gentleman, like, what do you have to do to join the Knights of Columbus? And obviously the answer is, well, you have to be a practicing Catholic.
Yeah.
That's where it starts. So he was he was proactive in our entry into the church too. And Michael is actually the oldest Catholic in our family because he didn't have to wait to Easter Vigil to enter. He was old enough to enter, make a profession of faith, and enter. And so I think it was like a couple of days before us, so not by much, but he beat us to
That's interesting, and I think what a lot of people don't realize is that when you're over the age of reason, over the age of 7, you are considered, at least when it comes to conversion, an adult.
Yes.
So if you're 7, if you're 8, if you're 9, if you're 10, you have to go through our CIA, at least in what they use right now in the modern church, or as we would say in the traditional world, you have to go through private catechism and in order to be received into the church. And at that age, you would also receive confirmation.
Yes, indeed.
When you come into the church.
Yes.
Now, your youngest, who was only 4, would be similar to Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, who was what he called a cradle convert, that he was still under the age of reason when he became Catholic. So your youngest child was very much like that. I want to go into a little bit about, you've now converted, you're living in Northern Virginia, you're married, but yet you felt the call to the priesthood, and maybe talk a little bit about what John Paul II allowed in what's called the pastoral provision. At least back then it was called the pastoral provision, and then what later on Benedict XVI expanded. And if you could talk a little bit about that and what brought you to where you are as a priest today.
So, when I converted to Catholicism, I entered the church knowing that I would have to lay down the priesthood. You don't negotiate with the church. Okay? When you enter the church, you enter as you are. And so I entered, properly speaking, as a layman, right? But I had several conversations where, in fact, 2 bishops, both Bishop Laverde of the Arlington Diocese and the Archbishop of Nassau, asked me the same question, though it seemed odd to me. He said, did your call to priesthood diminish after you entered the church? Now, when Bishop Laverde asked that question, it sounded odd to me. But when the Archbishop of Nassau repeated the same question, I began to realize this is a kind of litmus test. They're sounding to see what it's. And I said to the Archbishop, I said, honestly, Archbishop, I wish it had, because then my life would be simple. I could just go about my business and be normal. And so he said, well, what we'll do, this is the Archbishop of Nassau, he said, we will put you under observation for the next 2 years. After which, and that's really testing whether your conversion is real, the substantive conversion, or if there's some whimsical thing. We will make a petition to Rome on your behalf. And this fit with the Diocese of Arlington's plan, because Arlington never ordained married men to the priesthood. When men like me came into the church in Arlington, Arlington would always commend them to another diocese. And because I was born and raised in the Bahamas, they commended me to Nassau. So 2 years later, the Archbishop of Nassau petitioned Rome on my behalf, and they expected it would take like 3 years or so before they'd get a nod. Well, 4 months later, Rome said, yes, you could. They approved my.
That's very fast for Rome.
Very, very fast, and it caught the Archdiocese off guard. They figured they had 3 years to raise the money to send me to seminary. They had 4 months, and they didn't have money. So they petitioned the Congregation of Doctrine and Faith to allow them to have me do my priestly formation, seminaries, 4 years of seminary, one-on-one with an expert priest. And the congregation said, yes, you can do that. And so one of the lead priests of the Diocese of Arlington became my formator, Father Paul de Laurante, an excellent Catholic teacher. And so weekly, one-on-one, we would have sessions for the next 2.5 to 3 years, completing the full seminary course of studies.
Now, I think for a lot of our listeners, the question will come about, well, wait a second. Yeah, you just said that the Diocese of Arlington doesn't ordain married men. Obviously, Roman Catholics, priests are celibate. Speak a little bit about why the church, from your understanding under John Paul II and then Benedict, started to allow priests that converted, or I should say men that converted from other faiths, to be ordained priests even though they were married.
So this actually, what John Paul II did with the pastoral provision, he created a mechanism by which former Anglican ministers, who, like me, still sense the call to priesthood after they converted, could be ordained to the priesthood despite the fact that they were married. Okay, John Paul II was the first one to create the structure that made it possible. He called it pastoral provision, but actually, you might say the momentum for this started much earlier, somewhere in the 1930s and 40s. It was on Pius XII's mind considerably, but no particular action was taken. And the reason was because there were so many men, Anglican ministers, who were entering the church or wanting to enter the church, but the fact that they would certainly not be ordained to the priesthood made them hesitant. Many of them still entered the church and remained as laymen for the rest of their lives, but some did not. Mm-hmm. So John Paul II created the pastoral provision, which allowed on a candidate per candidate basis for married men to be evaluated for the possibility of ordination to the sacred priesthood, with this caveat. And the caveat is that upon the death of their wife, they could not remarry. It was mimicking the Eastern Catholic tradition. So it was, in a sense, taking a practice from the Eastern rites and sort of inserting it into the practice of the
It's interesting
Latin.
that you say that Pius XII was also dealing with this, because during his pontificate, a lot of Catholics today might not realize that there was an abundance of converts from Anglicanism to Catholicism. They were reading the works of Tolkien, of Chesterton, even C.S. Lewis, who never fully converted, and they were jumping ship. One of the new doctors of the church, John Henry Newman, was actually at the forefront of that with the Oxford movement. And you saw basically from the mid-19th century really up until Vatican II, especially in the so-called intellectual class of Great Britain and the Commonwealth, what used to be called the Empire, you saw many people converting. I want to get back a little bit, though, just for clarification. So you were living in the Diocese of Arlington in Virginia, but you were studying for the Archdiocese of Nassau. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Nassau did not have the money to send you to the seminary. They thought that they would have a few more years before Rome would allow it. And they asked if an expert priest could teach you one-on-one, which is actually a great way to learn. It was how it was done before Trent. And while there are many great things about the seminary system, there's an argument to be made that there is a great asset to being taught one-on-one. What a lot of people don't realize, the patron of priests, St. John Vianney, was taught one-on-one. He could not, because of the French Revolution, because of the circumstances in his life, he could not attend seminary in regular formation, so he had one-on-one, and he is the model for all priests. What, though, brought you from there, and give us a timeline about what year that was, to where you were being ordained for the ordinariate?
So what happened was, although the Archdiocese of Nassau received permission to have me form enter formation as a priest. The final rescript authorizing ordination would come later. That's still the practice. And I believe so even within the ordinariate. And the final rescript is received after the formation is completed. But about halfway through my formation, Rome wrote to the Archdiocese of Nassau denying them the right to ordain me. But it was a very interesting letter. What the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith said is, we want you to continue with Vaughn Treco's formation toward priesthood, but we're denying you the right of ordination. When he's done with his formation, he can apply to any other diocese other than yours for ordination. And
Was there any reason given for that?
the one on paper is one thing, but I will tell you what the Archbishop said to me, okay? Because this makes the most sense. He said, Vaughn, you are the first convert Protestant minister ever in this country to Catholicism.
Meaning the Bahamas.
The Bahamas. And your family is known everywhere in this country. And Rome believes that that will impede your ability to function normally as a priest in this archdiocese because it's so small. So he said that's the verbal explanation given. The official explanation is vague beyond recognition.
And what year was this?
This would have been in 2010-ish.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happened then was I completed my formation shortly thereafter, and my daughter Catherine was just about to enter high school, and it just didn't seem prudent to me to switch locations and throw that type of transition on Catherine as she's entering such an important stage of her life. So I told the Archbishop, I thanked the Archbishop of Nassau, now Archbishop Pinder of Nassau, and I thanked Bishop Laverde of Arlington for their assistance. And I said, but I'm going to wait until Catherine is done with high school before I take any action with regards to this. As it turns out, in the interim period, the ordinariate was formed. Benedict XVI formed the three ordinariates. The one for the United States and Canada, the ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, one for England and Wales, ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, and then the ordinariate for Australia of the Southern Cross. So those were formed, and I entered the second class of priests being formed for the ordinariate. So I completed 4 years of priestly formation under Father de la Durante in 3 years, and then for the ordinary, I received another 6 months of training.
So when were you ordained? Where were you ordained? And who ordained you?
Okay. So I was ordained for the ordinariate, but at the time, the ordinariate didn't have a bishop. Ordinariate of the Church of St. Peter. Monsignor Jeffrey Steenson was a former Anglican bishop, but he was not a Catholic bishop. So when ordinations for priests who had entered the ordinariate came up, the diocese in which they would function physically typically became the diocese. One of their bishops would be the ordaining bishop for that candidate, with Monsignor Steenson in attendance. And that's what happened. I was being ordained to serve in the within the boundaries of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis. And so one of their auxiliary bishops, Bishop Andrew Cousins, was designated the bishop to ordain me to the priesthood. The Archbishop at the
Is
time,
he now the Bishop of Duluth?
He's the bishop of one of the...
Yeah, he's one of the dioceses in Minnesota. I can't remember
I don't think
which
it's
one.
Duluth.
But one of them, yeah.
Yeah, but one of the dioceses. But the then current Archbishop of the diocese, Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis. For whatever reason, his name escapes me at the moment.
Archbishop Hebner.
No, his predecessor.
Oh, before him. Okay.
Yeah, so he ordained me to the transitional diaconate along with the diocese's transitional deacons that year on May 2nd in the Basilica of St. Mary's in Minneapolis. So that was May 2nd. And then on May 3rd at the Church of the Holy Family, or Holy Family Catholic Church, Bishop Cousins ordained me to the sacred priesthood on May 3rd, the following day.
So you're ministering at this point, this is about 2015, 2016.
Yes, May 2nd and May 3rd, 2015.
You are ministering in the Twin Cities.
Yes.
And you're living with your wife. Mm-hmm. Then you had a sermon.
Yes.
That kind of went viral.
Yeah.
And you could thank Remnant Newspaper for that, for getting it out there. Tell us a little bit about the sermon and what some people might consider it controversial that got you canceled.
Yeah. So it was the Summer of Shame. That's what I call it. Others have called it that. I probably picked it up from somebody else. The Summer of Shame is 2018. The McCarrick story is breaking again. And I don't know how other people experienced that summer, but I watched the faithful of our small community. You could say I watched their sense of balance atrophy, their confidence in the church begin to wither away. Because this is iconic of where the devastation in the church in a way that they just thought had gone, that we were past this. Because McCarrick was one of the architects that responded to the first wave in 2002. He helped construct the protocols, you might say, and then come to find out in 2018, being publicly exposed as one of the predators himself, and a master predator. So that summer, I said to my wife, I'm going to have to address this, but I'm going to have to take months to think through this. And so I started writing my sermon. Normally my sermons, I go in five editions, right? But I typically only have a week, so just I call them versions. By the time I gave this sermon, the sermon I gave was on the counting scale, the 26th or 27th version.
For that week?
For that week.
Wow.
I had thought through this sermon for months. Every single word was chosen. It was one of the first sermons in a long time that I had done a full and complete manuscript for. But I knew every word would matter. In fact, in the sacristy, just before I started Mass that day, I changed one word from worship to prayer because prayer was specifically what I had in mind, not worship in general. Mm-hmm. And the sentence would have left open,
So you really crafted this sermon. This was not just something off the cuff, something riled you up, and this happens as priests. I'm always amazed. I'll meet priests who say, oh yeah, I write my Advent homilies in August. And I'm thinking, what if something tragic happens? Think of September 11th. Between now and then, that's going to change your whole outlook on how you do things. And we will have in the description, Matthias, if we can make sure to have in the description a link to Father's homily, which I believe is still at Remnant Newspaper.
So my sermon was not fueled by any anger. It was I would say it was animated by pastoral angst. And a genuine charity for the people entrusted in my care to help them, to give them a way of thinking about the situation and processing the summer of shame that would allow them to get through it and actually be stronger, more devout Catholics. So that was my whole purpose in it. And what caused me to write it in the particular way I wrote it is because it seemed that everybody who was addressing this problem was addressing symptoms. But addressing symptoms doesn't help. You need to address what the source of the problem was. And that's what my attempt was. Funnily enough, several prelates said to me, in your sermon, there's nothing in your sermon that prominent, even members of the Curia have said. So the strong reaction that you got from your bishop seems incongruous. If you had said something fantastical that had never been said before by people in authority, then his response might have made sense. But there we have it.
So you get called in, you get canceled for this, and when you came to the coalition, when I was running it, we just couldn't believe why you were disciplined the way you were. And I want you to kind of describe that in all charity, obviously, but it's just in the true word, fantastic. It's just amazing because I couldn't believe it when I heard this. So when I was running the coalition, we obviously had a team that handled priests applying, and we obviously do background checks, and now even with Unprofitable Servants, we do background checks. We're just not helping any priest that comes to us. We want to make sure, A, they are a priest, validly ordained, and we want to make sure that they didn't do anything wrong to warrant what happened. And so when we found out what happened to you, the punishment that was given to you, we just couldn't believe it, thinking, there has to be another reason. I mean, this is coming from somebody who has already been canceled for over 10 years at this point, and they're bringing it to me, the team is bringing it to me saying, this doesn't make any sense. I said, it doesn't make any sense to us. Let's dig deeper. What was it, in my opinion, an overreaction did your bishop do, the bishop of the ordinariate?
What led him to do it?
Well, what did he do? What was the canonical
So
action he took against you?
Well, the first canonical action he took was on January 15th, 2019. This was after a series of email exchanges, one visit to the Chancery, and, well, I should say 2 visits on the same trip to the Chancery.
In Houston.
In Houston.
Okay.
And then the rest through email correspondence. On January 15th, okay, so by then, before we get to January 15th, he had given me 6 things that I had to do in order to move forward. Well, 3 of them were easily done, and I did immediately. I could do in conscience. One of them was a longer-term thing that had to follow. But 2 things he required is that I make a public retraction of my sermon, right, in its entirety, and that I apologize to my brother priests in the ordinariate for what harm done to them because of the sermon. And I told him, I said, I would be happy to retract any statement or even the whole sermon if you could demonstrate to me that in that sermon I said something contrary to the Catholic religion. And he never produced such reasons. And I said, in conscience, therefore, I cannot say that I'd said something wrong when I believe what I said was right and true. I said, I just can't do that. So I couldn't do those 2 letters. But the other 4 things, 3 of the other 4 were fulfilled. And the last one was to attend certain classes to be determined later at the local seminary. Well, that would have followed the other 2. When I told him, in several exchanges, that I was unable in conscience to do it, he suspended me on January 15, 2019. I received that note on my way to Mass, which meant it took effect immediately. So at Mass, before Mass, I would hear confessions. I could not hear confessions because it restricted my faculties. I couldn't hear confessions, and I could not preach, right? I could offer the Mass. In response to that, I immediately contacted a canon lawyer. A friend of mine had told me, you need to get a canon lawyer. So I said, you know a canon lawyer? Right? I said, I don't know a canon lawyer. I never needed a canon lawyer before. So he got back to me with a recommendation. He recommended Robert Flummerfeld, who practices canon law and civil law
in Las Vegas.
In Las
of all
Vegas,
places,
exactly.
Yes.
That was an interesting thing. And Robert, when I spoke with him, I described my situation. I said, Robert, I have 97 cents or so in the bank. I have no money. I said, so I'm calling you, tell you my situation, and asking you if you would take my case, not pro bono, but with deferred payment. I will pay you when God gives me the money to pay you. And he said, yes, he would do that during my case. He said, but with one caveat. He says, it is really important for you that you give me a retainer. That will be helpful to you. I don't need it, but you need it. So I said, okay. I said, I have no idea where I'm going to get $1,000, but I've been in this situation before. I'll ask the Lord. So after that conversation ended, let's say, 10 in the morning, I sent an email to some friends who were assisted at Mass at St. Bede's. The name of our ordinary community was St. Bede's Catholic Church. And within an hour, I got a text back. One of the gentlemen said, I believe my wife and I can cover your retainer, and I can get you the check this afternoon. I said, I just need to actually have a verbal conversation with my wife to confirm. He did, got back to me. We met at a Panera Bread. He gave me a check for $1,000. I called Robert back. I said, I have your $1,000. And he smiled. I could see his smile over the phone.
I love when you tell that story.
Yeah.
I love when you tell that story. We only have about 8 minutes left.
Okay.
And I want to get into this because you bring up something very important, something that Dan Seveny brought up, who I interviewed last week on this topic, is because when the coalition imploded, you had a lot of what I like to call armchair reporters or armchair commentators, meaning that they're sitting at home comfortably commenting on news of the world on social media, say, when they saw the coalition as a 501c3 implode, they came out and said, this is why you shouldn't give money to organizations. You should give them directly to priests. And Dan kind of thought, no, that's not a good idea because, one, people that do give a large amount, and people have to realize it has to be a large amount in order for the IRS to actually give you a kickback. Kickback's not the right word, but you know what I mean. That it's actually better to see the accountability with a 501c3 because, there are priests out there who, living on donations, are able to live a very comfortable life. You and I both know priests who monthly get $9,000 to $10,000 in donations, and that's just for them to live. That's very comfortable living for somebody who's a celibate, living by themselves. That covers a lot of things. And Dan was very adamant that, no, people should be giving to organizations, and those organizations should have an accountability and show it, which the coalition was not doing. You came to the coalition when I was running it, and you were very impressed with both the thoroughness of our background check and also the aid that we were giving. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is canon lawyers, while not as expensive as civil attorneys, are still expensive. I mean, they're still charging about $250 an hour.
Yep.
And, for a priest that makes maybe $1,500 a month, $250 is a lot of money.
Yep.
And so you were basically cut off. And what I was amazed at is eventually he tried to excommunicate you. That's now going through the process in Rome, either to be confirmed or for it to be overturned. the craziness about it is that anyone that looks at this is like, you got excommunicated for this sermon? And again, I encourage everyone to go to the link that we're providing and listen to this sermon. It's excellent. And so you came to the coalition, was impressed with how quickly we started helping you. Why do you think it's important that we have an organization like Unprofitable Servants now that the coalition has imploded in order to help priests?
Yep. Well, when priests are dependent, any priest who's been canceled and who wishes to live out their priestly life is caught in a conundrum. The ordinary demands of priestly life don't easily square with other demands. Okay, and so if a priest is going to live out his priestly life in the best way possible, most full way possible, he's going to require some type of assistance. The reason it's more advantageous to receive it from an organization is organizations are typically not prone to emotional decisions. They have stated principles. The priest either adheres to them, fits within those principles, the scheme of the organization is set up. And so for the priest, there's a stability in that. If he gets promised a certain amount of support on a monthly basis, he'll know that somebody's not going to get upset with him and then withdraw their support. That's on the priest side. It creates a tremendous amount of stability. That's what it did for me. When the coalition came alongside me, I can remember what Father Scott Duvall said. It was the most freeing words I had heard in years, because I was still spinning in the impact of the actions taken against me. He said, Father Treco, you were not ordained to DoorDash. You were not ordained to shop for groceries. You were ordained to administer the sacraments and offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And that's what we're going to help you do. Those words from Father Scott Duvall changed my life. In fact, the couple, Catholic couple who had given my wife and I a cottage to live in, rent-free, right, said, within days, she said, you changed. Within days of my contact with the coalition, she said, you changed. Your whole demeanor changed. Your sense of balance, it became obvious. So that's the first thing. On the other side, I think it's really important for donors, because when a donor gives money directly to a priest, now, I'm not against donors giving money directly to a priest. Let's just start there. But when a donor gives money directly to a priest, donors may not be aware of this, but if they get upset with the priest does something, right? If they withdraw that support hastily, they literally throw the priest into a crisis. Yeah. Not a little inconvenience, into a crisis. Mm-hmm. And I know this firsthand. So for the donor, the donor, by giving money to an organization, is not going, they'll look at that organization, yes, this organization is doing what it said it will do, or no, right? And that's why with Unprofitable Servants, one of the things that encouraged me when we spoke about Unprofitable Servants is the commitment to be publicly transparent on a monthly basis. People could go and see money's received, money dispersed. That type of accountability allows a donor to say, okay, I could continue to do this in conscience. I don't have to do the work to find out if this priest says blah, blah. They will do it.
Yeah.
And they state how they do it. They state. So that, I think those are the two principal benefits: stability for the priests and integrity, confidence and integrity of the organization for the donor.
I think you're absolutely right. And you know, Father, as I mentioned this to you before we started the podcast today. I said it's going to go by very quickly. And one thing that we did not get to, and this just means that we get to have you on again, is why you think priests should be celibate.
Yes.
And I think people need to hear that story. And I think that could take up a whole podcast by itself. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us again. This is Father John Lovell, Hope in the Desert. You could find out more information about helping canceled priests like Father Treco by going to unprofitableservants.org. Again, I would like to thank Sanctus Ranch as well as the RCCI, the Restoring Christian Culture Initiative, in hosting us and having us. Please like and subscribe, and until next time, may God bless you.